I know. Let's make lightning in the sword so that people think we are going to leave this open. Well, thankfully, another sequel didn't get made until this direct-to-video and DVD sequel got made, called Highlander Endgame. And this seemed to finally give us the Highlander sequel we had all been waiting for. It was badly acted, though. It has to be said. The only three characters I can think that were... No, four. I've got to give Christopher Lambert his due. He did actually do some very good acting in this movie. But that was Adrian Paul, Joe Dawson, I don't know the guys, Jim Burns, that's it, I beg your pardon. Jim Burns who played Joe Dawson, and Peter Wingfield as Mythos. He only had those very small bit parts, and I, for one, I'm not a huge fan of Mythos's character, but I know when he fights. And, you know, he actually turned out some of the best fighting sequences in the whole series, next to Duncan MacLeod. Obviously, we couldn't have the return of Richie in this movie, because I'm going to spoil it now in case some of you haven't seen the last episode of the 5th series, but Duncan MacLeod does behead Richie, obviously, as some of us die-hard Highlander fans know. And to me, Richie was a mixed up character. I mean, you start him off as this badass punk kid, and then decided to make him into this nice guy who, by the way, is immortal! And we never saw that coming. And that is something we didn't actually see coming, I will admit that. But the choice to make his character immortal after the death of Tessa was a very interesting move indeed. Was it going to make the series bad, or was it going to make it good? I personally feel it made it good, because that way you could carry on the story of Duncan teaching Richie the do's and don'ts of immortality. And yes, Richie did make some cock-ups of his own, obviously killing Mako and being sent into exile by Duncan himself, only to come back and be chased by a real badass immortal. Anyway, I'm trailing off to the series here. This is about the movies. Okay, Highlander Endgame. The villain was as camp as hell, and you know, he did put on a threatening performance and you believed him as a bad guy. But why? Oh, why did he have to put that voice on? Kurgan sounded very threatening in the first movie. You know, you believed he was a bad guy. You know, there was nothing nice about him. He could walk down the street and you would end up turning around the other way and walking off in the other direction. Perhaps even running. Katana, played by Michael Ironside. I can't say anything good about his villain. I don't know. The train wreck was a good scene in the whole movie. It didn't make any sense, but it was good. I mean, you know, just to see that train going at God knows how many miles an hour, just after he'd landed on Earth, and pulverised some poor guy, you know, who was just sat there staring at him. I thought that was probably, arguably, one of the best scenes in the movie. Anyway, back to Endgame. Putting the two together was brilliant. I mean, it was a very good pairing. They seemed to spar off one another quite well. But in all actuality, the movie seemed to be more about Duncan and continuing on the TV series premise than it did from the history of the movies. But then again, with sequels as bad as Highlander 2 and 3, can you really blame them? Anyway, we pick up with Connor and Duncan having some sort of conversation, and quite possibly one of the best explosions in the whole movie was the fire to kill Rachel. I mean, you know, this sends Connor into his whole depression, and it actually makes the movie work. Yes, I just said that. It actually makes the movie work. I know I'm probably going to get shot for saying that, but that's my opinion. And then, of course, as the movie drags on, and by drag I mean drag, even though it is a good sequel, it does still drag. We finally get to a conflicting point in the movie, which the first time I saw it, I never saw it coming, and that was a big showdown between Connor and Duncan. This is something you never thought would happen in the Highlander universe, but here it was, finally, before your eyes, the big battle. Who was gonna win? And it ends up being a huge, I feel sorry for you, but I'm gonna chop your head off anyway. And it was a good death, but Connor could have had a much better death, in my opinion. It's just, oh man. You know, the whole premise, the quickening was brilliant. You know, there were sparks flying, there was things crashing onto the ground that still doesn't seem to hit our main character. And anyway, the whole premise was to put both their strengths together so they would at least have a chance of defeating Kell, who had 661 confirmed immortal kills. Anyway, the story ends. They didn't even bother to think, could we leave this open for a sequel? Sadly, they did! Another sequel that was called, obviously, Highlander the Source. I have reviewed this already, but that was the Russian cut that for some bizarre reason I thought it was the final cut, until I read on the Highlander forums that it wasn't the final cut. We were still waiting for that. I have to say, I got rid of the Russian cut, thank you God. But I had to get the official cut just to see if they had made any improvements. Why? I can't stress how bad it was. They even tried to recut some of the footage at the end of the movie to recap everything that you had just seen. It's like you say to yourself, I have just seen this whole movie, why make me relive how bad it was? There was one good thing. Yes, there was actually a good thing about Highlander the Source. The opening. It was so much better done than the original Russian cut. And the titles were a lot better as well. I can't describe how bad this film was. It is like they just deliberately made it to be bad. This film, I have to say, it was worse than Batman and Robin, Superman 4 and Home Alone 4 put together. And that does take some doing. It's even worse than, dare I say it, Mummy, Tomb of the Dragon Emperor. That is another movie that they just set out to make to be bad and bomb at the box office. But I'll get into that another time if people will let me review another movie after completely ripping these sequels apart. And I think I'm probably going to get a lot of people agreeing with me after those god-awful guitar videos I posted 4 years ago when I was a naive teenager and thought anything I made sounded good. And yes, I am going to remove those at some point and hopefully do a better video. I mean, I'm trailing off again. This is part of Asperger's for you. We do trail off a lot. But no, Highlander the Source. I can't think of a worst movie I have ever seen in my life. Adrian Paul, who's from the TV series, as we all know, plays Duncan MacLeod. He manages to be witty, he manages to take his character into new dimensions. Even in the last series, he manages to take Duncan MacLeod into a place we have not seen him go before. This seems to be, what should I do? I know, I'll try and meddle all the depressing facts of Duncan MacLeod and put them together.